They had walked into a trap in the desert. The Germans began to fire at them. Ian heard one of the armored scout cars start up. They were going to make a run for it. There was no room, but he could hang on the side. Ian crouched over the side and held onto the communications mast for dear life as the dingo floored it, followed by a torrent of fire when the Germans saw them trying to escape. Bullets started hitting the car, sounding like heavy hail on a tin roof. Then an armor-piercing shell hit the ground, spraying him with stones as he watched the shell spin into the distance. That was getting a bit too close to be comfortable. Ian was hanging down as low as he could, but the next second a high explosive shell hit the scout car between the turret and the chassis, blowing the turret and him high in the air. Thanks to viewer Jamie Scalza2583 for discussing the iconic photo. This video wouldn't have been possible without the kindness and large amount of assistance from Ian's daughters, Jane Fitchett and Vicky Connolly, and Ian's grandson, Ben Fitchett. More information will follow about them at the end of the video. Many people who have watched videos and read books about World War II have seen this picture. It is a picture of a New Zealand soldier, kitted out, taking a break with his pipe. Almost no one knows the story behind this iconic World War II photo, but as we will soon find out, this soldier had incredible, hair-raising adventures before and after this photo. This is the true personal story of a New Zealand soldier's amazing experiences in World War II. Now, like many other heroes of the past, he later lived a quiet life, raising a family and never calling attention to his brave deeds and death-defying escapes. Ian considered the real heroes to be buried in the sands of North Africa and in the soil of Italy. This story will be told from Ian's point of view and will not include all details of everything going on far away, but mostly what affected him and his mates directly. Some of the photos in this video are from Ian's personal collection and have never been seen before by the public. So settle back, grab a cup of tea, and get ready for a story that you'll never forget. Here are the chapter headings for reference. Ian Lester Thomas was born in Christchurch, Canterbury, New Zealand on April 30, 1917, to Sydney Harry Thomas, 29, and Florence Emma Thomas, 31. Ian became a cadet for 6 years in the New Zealand Cadet Forces and joined the 9th Wellington East Coast Mounted Rifle Regiment for another 6 years, initially while still a cadet. Ian rose to the rank of sergeant before he joined the war. The 9th Wellington East Coast Mounted Rifles Regiment was a territorial force, similar to militia or National Guard units, which had a storied past fighting in the Gallipoli, the Sinai, and Palestine campaigns of World War I. Before the Second World War, Ian worked as a fat stock buyer for Swift & Company in Wairoa, which was, and still is, an animal protein producer and exporter. Ian worked with a meat processing plant where they processed mutton, lamb, goat, and beef. Interestingly, there were 18 other New Zealand soldiers who also listed this exact occupation and served their country in World War II. New Zealand felt a strong kinship and allegiance with Great Britain, seeing it as the mother country. This telegram, announcing that the United Kingdom had declared war on Germany, was received in New Zealand at 11:45 p.m. on the night of September 3, 1939. Although there was some delay in initial communication confusion, it eventually became clear what was going on, and New Zealand followed suit and backdated its declaration to the same moment when the United Kingdom had declared war, which was 9:30 p.m. on September 3rd. In a radio message on September 5th to the country announcing the declaration of war, a very ill Prime Minister Michael Joseph Savage declared,
"Both with gratitude for the past and with confidence in the future, we range ourselves without fear beside Britain. Where she goes, we go. Where she stands, we stand. We are only a small and young nation, but we are one and all a band of brothers, and we march forward with a union of hearts and wills to a common destiny.
As was usual in both world wars in Allied countries, recruiting officers were immediately swamped with eager young men trying to enlist. Because of the popular support and backing, the New Zealand coalition government decided to create two divisions, the first for home defense, and the second would be for possible overseas expeditions. The Empire of Japan was not at war with the Allies yet, so the 2nd New Zealand Expeditionary Force was free to head to Egypt. The 25th Battalion was raised for the division and was formed on May 15, 1940 at Trentham Military Camp in the lower North Island, an upper hut near Wellington. It started with 780 men, organized into 4 rifle companies along with a headquarters company consisting of specialized personnel such as signals and command staff. The 25th would be part of the 6th Infantry Brigade, one of the 3 infantry brigades of the 2nd New Zealand Division. Like many of the volunteers, Ian was not married when he enlisted as a private in the New Zealand Army on May 28, 1940 at the age of 23. He was 5'8" and 148 pounds. 2.5 weeks later, he began training at the Trentham military camp for the next 5 months. In late August, he became sick enough to be admitted to Wellington Hospital for a few days. However, he soon recovered and resumed training. Probably due to his prior military experience and rank with the cadets, in 9th Wellington East Coast Mounted Rifles Regiment, he was quickly promoted to Lance Corporal on October 2nd and then to Corporal just 2 weeks later, right before his embarkation. On November 7th, Ian and his fellow soldiers left for their long journey to Egypt, arriving at the Mediterranean coastal city of Port Said a little over a month later on December 12th. He was assigned as a replacement for the 2nd New Zealand Division's 25th Battalion of the 6th Infantry Brigade, which had arrived some months earlier. 25th Battalion spent the next 3 months intensively training for combat, learning hand-to-hand fighting techniques and vehicle training at Maadi Camp, which was the 2nd New Zealand Expeditionary Forces Training Center. They also conducted desert maneuvers as well as guarding military bases and POW camps. In between training sessions, Kiwis were allowed leave to visit Cairo and the pyramids. Ian bought a leather-bound photo album that has Egyptian designs on the cover during a visit to the Souk or Grand Bazaar in Cairo. The 25th Battalion also found time to engage in a number of sporting contests with the other battalions, including rugby, cricket, field hockey, and soccer. 25th Battalion went on to win the prestigious interdivisional 7-a-side desert rugby tournament. They fought hard and played hard. In 1940, Italian leader Benito Mussolini wanted to show Germany that the Italian army could be victorious using their own strategic initiative, so on October 28th, Italian troops attacked Greece across the mountainous and muddy terrain of the Albanian-Greek border and made some initial gains, but the Greek army wasn't a pushover like they had thought. About a week later, German Chancellor Adolf Hitler conferred with his general staff on the strategic goal of attacking Greece. However, at that time, there was a problem getting the troop transit rights from the Yugoslavian government. The Italian invasion was halted by mid-November, and a later Greek counterattack pushed the Italians back into Albania. By January 1941, the Italian army was miles away from their start line. Germany coerced Bulgaria into joining the Axis on March 1, 1941, and suddenly the Wehrmacht had the ability to outmaneuver the Greek army by invading where their army was thinly deployed. British ground troops arrived in Greece the next day, although the Royal Air Force already had a small force in the region. Hitler saw British involvement as a threat to the Axis rear and the Romanian oil fields. This was unacceptable to the German High Command, especially with the upcoming invasion of the Soviet Union looming on the immediate horizon. There was also a need to save the Italians from their disastrous military situation, so the Wehrmacht quickly made plans and converged on the Bulgarian border. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill made the political decision to send whatever troops were available to support the Greeks, believing it was vital for Britain to take every measure possible to support Greece. On January 8th, he stated, There was no other course open to us but to make certain that we had spared no effort to help the Greeks, who had shown themselves so worthy. This was really an emotional political decision because militarily it was a potential disaster waiting to happen for the Allies. But, right or wrong, Churchill had his way, and British, New Zealand, and Australian soldiers were shipped from Egypt to Greece, protected by the Royal Navy. The thought was that it would be better to suffer with the Greeks than to make no attempt to help them. Although the Greek army had stabilized the front against the Italians in February 1941, the Italians had reinforced the Albanian front to 28 divisions against the Greeks' 14 divisions. Greek reinforcement of the Albanian front came at the expense of the Macedonian and Thracian fronts, which included the Metaxas line, which was the Greek version of the French Maginot line. 9 divisions were required for its defense, but Greek commanders were reluctant to withdraw any troops from the Albanian front. There was a chronic shortage of arms and equipment in the Greek army. Even with British support, the Greeks were fast approaching the end of their supplies. British intelligence estimated that Greek reserves, although numbering 200,000 to 300,000 partially trained men on paper, could not be mobilized for lack of arms and equipment, which were being consumed by the Albanian front. By the end of March 1941, the Greek army possessed 1 month's supply of artillery ammunition. The British had already provided a large amount of ammunition and supplies, some of it captured from the Italians in North Africa. So it was in this context that the 2nd New Zealand Division stepped in to defend Greece in March 1941, along with their Allied brethren, totaling over 65,000 men, in addition to the Greek army of 450,000. Ian and his mates arrived at Piraeus port on March 18th, which is about 6 miles or 10 kilometers away from central Athens, where he snapped this photo of the port. The men of 25th Battalion were allowed a few days of leave and found they preferred Athens to Egypt, especially the opportunity to see a green countryside again. They didn't miss the desert flies that seemed to be everywhere in Egypt, and found Athens to be a much cleaner city than Cairo. Ian visited ancient Greek temples, taking it all in. The 25th Battalion traveled north to fairly rugged mountainous terrain to prepare defenses on the coastal portion of the Aliakman line. Part of the division's mission, along with the Australians, was to destroy the Aliakman river bridges to delay any German advance. The New Zealanders were very poorly equipped with World War I-era bolt-action Lee-Enfield rifles and had a limited amount of machine guns spread thinly around. They were also short of tanks and anti-aircraft guns. They had no idea what the future held. Ian stated, "We didn't even know that the German tanks had crosses on the sides of them." In contrast, the Wehrmacht was the most powerful military force in Europe. The overall combat force ratio was about 2.5 to 1 in favor of the Axis powers. Yugoslavian military officers executed a coup d'etat on March 27th, to which the Axis reacted very rapidly by invading both Yugoslavia and Greece on April 6th. Since the Wehrmacht could now invade via Yugoslavia, it permitted them to mostly avoid the undermanned Metaxas line and unhinge the overall Allied defensive strategy. The important port of Piraeus was bombed and virtually destroyed on the night of April 6th. The Germans advanced rapidly behind the Aliakman line. 6th Brigade had to abandon its positions and withdrew to the Olympus Pass on April 9th. This marked the beginning of a gradual retreat down the country, fighting a series of rearguard actions by elements of the 2nd New Zealand Division. Ian recalled, "The Germans were much stronger than us, more tanks, guns, and aeroplanes. They chased us right back to where we landed." The commander of the 25th Battalion was veteran Lieutenant Colonel Alan Wilder, who had served with the Wellington Mounted Rifles during the First World War. He believed that men were mightier than machines, despite the obvious superiority of the panzers and the aircraft. He strictly ordered that no one was to fire their rifles at enemy planes because he wanted to preserve ammunition and to not give their position away. Most of the planes were Stuka dive bombers that screeched whenever they dived. Ian remembered. So we're on a convoy stopped on the road. Everybody in the ditches or whatever for shelter. And the Germans would just bomb the first few vehicles at the head of the convoy, then fly over the top of us at about 25 feet up, and we weren't allowed to fire back. We could see the pilots grinning and waving at us as they flew over. We were thick on the ground, nose to tail. We could have shot down aircraft no trouble at all, as there were hundreds of us, but the order was not to fire at enemy aircraft. Wilder was a First World War man, an old man. He didn't know what dive bombing was all about. None of us did. The screaming siren on the Stuka was badly upsetting to some soldiers. It certainly upset morale. It upset a friend of mine so badly that he went missing after we'd been on retreat for some nights. I hadn't seen him for 2 days, and the company head told me to go and look for him. Nobody had seen him around. I went looking in some trees, and here he was, this nice little guy in a slint trench he built for himself so that he could lie down. He'd pulled some branches and made a roof over the top. I called him, and his head stuck out. I asked him what he was doing there, and he said, "I don't like the dive bombers." I told him they weren't bombing us, but he said they upset him, and he didn't like them. He didn't remember when he had last eaten, and he was very upset. When they later got back to Egypt, Ian persuaded his friend to get a base job, telling him that he wasn't doing himself or anyone else much good as a frontline soldier. 2 years later, Ian saw him again, and he was doing fine in the rear with the gear. By April 13th, the Greek army started to disintegrate under the weight of the German attack, and 25th Battalion was pulled back to a town called Moyos, which is near modern Thermopylae, to defend a key mountain pass and natural choke point leading to Athens and southern Greece. Ian and his mates had no maps of the area, no escape routes, and were told virtually nothing about what was happening. Ian saw only one Allied aircraft in Greece, but the Germans had thousands. It was here that Ian first experienced combat and rearguard battles with the German 5th Panzer Division. The men found that Boy's anti-tank rifles were useless against the Panzers. Although short of anti-tank weapons and constantly harassed by dive-bombing Stukas, 25th Battalion managed to stubbornly hold the Panzers back and allow the remainder of Allied troops to escape. They tenaciously defended Moyos for a day longer than they had been ordered, finally withdrawing in the long retreat south, catching up with the rest of the Allies on April 25th, Anzac Day. Ian described the chaotic evacuation scene. "It was pretty rough. We threw away everything, helmets, rifles, ammunition, web gear, bayonets, and were ordered to get into a big whaleboat and told to row out to the Ajax in the pitch dark, with 30 aboard and only 6 rowing. We were told the Germans were 1.5 miles up the road, and there was to be dead silence. In the dark, someone kicked out the bung in the whaleboat, which is a drain plug, and it started sinking. Despite the pitch-black conditions, somehow they managed to find the HMS Ajax before the boat completely filled with water. Ian was the last man off the boat and felt it sink beneath him as he leapt onto the mesh ladder hanging from the British light cruiser Ajax. It was a race against time as 800 German paratroopers landed on April 26th at Corinth Canal in an effort to cut off the evacuation of the Allied forces from the beaches further south. 4th and 5th Brigades were taken off beaches to the east of Athens and were shipped to Crete for its defense. 25th Battalion was one of the last units evacuated from Greece. Many of Ian's platoon were captured, killed, or wounded during the retreat. Casualties during the 25th Battalion's campaign in Greece amounted to about 30 killed and wounded, with 150 personnel captured. The majority of captured personnel were from the battalion's reinforcement company, which had been left in Athens when the 6th Brigade moved north, as well as a truckload of infantrymen that had been misdirected far south to Kalamata during the retreat. Due to their losses, some of 6th Brigade went directly to Egypt, but others, like Ian, stayed a week in Crete before being returned to Egypt to be reformed, rearmed, and re-equipped. Overall, the 2nd New Zealand Division sustained losses of 291 men killed, 387 seriously wounded, and 1,826 men captured in Greece. The Battle of Crete, codenamed Operation Mercury by the Germans, began on the morning of May 20th, 1941, with multiple German airborne landings. Although Ian didn't participate in this battle, it's worth noting that 671 New Zealanders were killed, 967 wounded. and 2,180 captured from his division. Their loss would be felt because these men would have to be replaced and retrained soon. By late May, after a period of training and refitting, the 25th Battalion was back up to full strength and moved to Kantara West to protect the strategically important Suez Canal. Following the Battle of Crete, it was feared that the canal itself was vulnerable to attack by German paratroopers. One of the highly prized weapons in World War II was the American Thompson submachine gun, also known as the Tommy gun. The British had purchased as many as they could from the United States, but there was a limited supply and they were expensive, $200 in 1939, and came down to $70 in 1942, whereas a Sten gun could be manufactured for only $11. Tommy guns were highly prized by many Allied troops, and it proved itself over and over in combat, especially in close quarters. Ian was lucky enough to be able to test fire a Tommy gun out in the desert. Notice the Jeep in the background. He seems to have appreciated the weapon, because as we will see, he carried it later in the war. In September 1941, the battalion shifted to the Bagush Box, a British Army field fortification 35 miles east of Mersa-Matruh, to carry out training exercises and continue the integration of replacements received following the Greek battles. The Allied railway line from Egypt stopped at Mersa-Matruh in this period of the war. The battalion improved the area defenses and underwent intensive training in open desert warfare. They could even view the sea, and many soldiers went to the beach for a swim when they could. Since Churchill had ordered much of the Allied Western Desert Force to be sent elsewhere, the small force left in North Africa was short of supplies and equipment. General-Lieutenant Erwin Rommel's Africa Corps pushed back this token force in early 1941, but the Axis forces couldn't take Tobruk. This bastion was a thorn in his side, and the 9th Australian Division, also known as the Rats of Tobruk, held out against attack after attack. Further seesaw battles changed little. Operation Crusader would be the newest attempt to relieve the besieged Tobruk garrison. On June 22nd, Germany and other Axis countries invaded the Soviet Union. The effect that this had on the Desert War was that the German High Command suddenly saw North Africa as a distraction and a sideshow. The British viewed this as an opportunity to focus their efforts on winning North Africa and drawing Germans away from the Soviet front. The New Zealanders under Major General Bernard Freyberg would be part of 8th Army's relief plan as part of 13th Corps. Over 100,000 inspired men, 600 tanks, and 5,000 vehicles were on the Allied side. Operation Crusader kicked off on November 18, 1941 with an attack that surprised Rommel, who didn't expect any Allied movement until December. He had been misled by false British planted documents captured in an earlier raid. Bad weather grounded both sides' air forces. However, this meant that Axis air reconnaissance couldn't detect the Allied buildup. German radio interceptors noticed complete radio silence on the Allied side, which was a troubling sign. The 2nd New Zealand Division had 1,000 vehicles spread over 100 miles while advancing. By November 20th, elements of British 7th Armoured had taken Sidi Rezai, the airfield, and Point 175. The next day, the 2nd New Zealand Division advanced to Sidi Aziz, heading towards Sidi Rezai, with the ultimate goal of Tobruk. At the same time, the British 70th Infantry Division was attacking out of the Tobruk pocket. Rain soaked everyone overnight, while 6th Brigade made a nighttime march on the Triga Capuzzo. In the distance, Rommel's Africa Corps had counterattacked the British forces trying to take Tobruk. 6th Brigade halted at 8 p.m. for a hot meal, a rest, and resupply, knowing that the German-held Point 175 would be needed to be taken tomorrow. The New Zealanders were blissfully unaware that the British had had a disastrous day fighting the Africa Corps to the west, losing a lot of men and armor in a series of battles and rearguard actions. Freyberg ordered 4th Brigade to march from Bardia to the 6th Brigade area, leaving the 5th Brigade around Bardia and Sollum to watch the Italian garrisons there. In the early morning hours of November 23rd, 6th Brigade moved through the darkness trying to avoid Bir el Khita, but their guides got mixed up and went there anyway. This was a fortunate accident, because they captured Afrika Korps General der Panzertruppe Ludwig Kruvel's headquarters and took 200 German prisoners, capturing wireless sets and its cipher staff. Kruvel and his chief of staff Fritz Bayerlein had left only 30 minutes before. This was Ian's and 25th Battalion's first encounter with Rommel's Afrika Korps. Here's a picture of Ian. The 2nd New Zealand Division attacked and took the eastern portion of the strategically important hill of Point 175 against desperate German resistance. The Germans lost 300 men and 25th Battalion lost over 400 men in this action, so it wasn't an easy fight. Miles away in the west, the Afrika Korps was destroying the 5th South African Brigade and damaging what was left of 30 Corps. The British only had 75 tanks left by the end of the day in the west, but the Afrika Korps still had at least 150. Ian's battalion renewed its attack and captured the western part of Point 175, taking 200 German prisoners. Freiberg's men were low on supplies due to German interdiction. The 70th Division in Tobruk and the New Zealand Division made a fresh effort to link up. 6 battalions left at 9 p.m. After some delay, the Kiwis attacked around the Sidi Rezai Mosque. By dawn, Freiberg's eager infantrymen advanced with their bayonets fixed and had captured Sidi Rezai, wiping out the Italians, but the men were disorganized and couldn't push on. Soldiers from Tobruk attacked and captured Edi Duda from behind, which lifted Kiwi spirits. At 1 a.m., on the morning of November 27th, one of the primary goals of Operation Crusader was achieved by the New Zealand 19th Battalion. They linked up with the 32nd Brigade from Tobruk. The Afrika Korps destroyed the 5th New Zealand Brigade and planned to destroy the rest of the New Zealand Division and re-establish the chokehold on Tobruk. The New Zealanders were getting desperate. Under constant shelling, supplies were running low and they were attacked from different directions. Around this time, 21st Battalion ambushed and captured 21st Panzer Division commander German Generalmajor Hans von Ravenstein near Point 175 as he was traveling to visit 15th Panzer Division's headquarters. His captured maps were helpful preparing against future 21st Panzer Division attacks. The Kiwis had the honor of capturing the first German general in World War II. There was no reinforcement from the South Africans, and the Italian Ariete Division captured Point 175, took 200 prisoners, freed 200 German POWs, and overtook a New Zealand hospital. December 1st was Battalion Commander Major Henry Burton's birthday, which he and the rest of 25th Battalion celebrated near the blockhouse at Sidi Rezai. As a seeming birthday present, Gatehouse's British 4th Armour Brigade arrived while being shelled. Here's a view from inside the blockhouse. If you look closely, you can see S.W. Brooks on November 1942, with the exact date uncertain. And you can see 2NZEF at the bottom. Here's some battle damage to the blockhouse. 6th Brigade withdrew northeast to join other New Zealand units. Freiberg had lost confidence in both the British and the South Africans, and felt that the 2nd New Zealand Division had been abandoned, and bluntly stated this to the British commanders. He insisted that his battered division be withdrawn from the battle, which was approved by the British High Command. Only 5th Brigade, which was separated from the rest of the division, stayed behind around Bardia to fight on in Operation Crusader. Rommel, realizing that many of his supply ships had been sunk, ordered that all Axis forces should retreat, ending the Tobruk siege, and Operation Crusader became an Allied victory. This was the first major Allied victory over German forces in North Africa. At the end of the fight, the Allies suffered 17,700 casualties, lost 278 tanks, and 300 aircraft. The Axis suffered 38,300 casualties, lost 300 tanks, and 600 aircraft. Operation Crusader was a very costly campaign for the 2nd New Zealand Division. More New Zealand soldiers were killed or taken prisoner during Operation Crusader than in any other campaign the division fought in the Second World War, and more New Zealanders died, were wounded, or reported missing than any other 8th Army Division. Total New Zealand casualties were 4,620, 879 killed, and 1,699 wounded, and 2,042 men became prisoners of war. Ian and 25th Battalion were again back in Bagush for a rest and reinforcement when they heard about the Japanese surprise attack on Pearl Harbor and the United States' entry into the war. There they spent Christmas and the New Year. Their annual inter-battalion rugby tournament was again competed for, and this photo shows Ian with the 25th Battalion side. The 25th Battalion marked the New Year with an unauthorized display of fireworks, firing parachute flares, tracer ammunition, mortars, and even artillery rounds, all of which contributed to a magnificent spectacle. In mid-January 1942, they moved to Mahdi Camp near Cairo, the first camp that 25th Battalion, now the veterans of 2 campaigns, had arrived at in Egypt 15 months earlier. 25th Battalion stayed at Mahdi Camp until late February when they received orders to move east to Syria to counter a possible German attack from Greece through Turkey and into the vital oil fields of the Middle East. The journey took a couple of weeks by rail and road, traveling back across Egypt to the Suez Canal, through the Sinai and up the Mediterranean coast of Palestine, now Israel, to Lebanon, where they headed inland to their base at Syria. A couple of Ian's photos were probably taken during this journey, one being this group of soldiers in front of the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. And the other was Ian with 2 friends in Tel Aviv. The boys tried to unwind a bit by trout fishing, army style. And playing cricket. 25th Battalion remained stationed in Syria until June 1942, when they were once again called back to Egypt to face the resurgent Afrika Korps. Ian and 25th Battalion arrived back in Egypt just in time to take an important part in the famous Battle of El Alamein. The battle was fought in 2 major phases in July and October-November 1942, and was widely credited with turning the tide against the Germans in World War II. The New Zealanders were now much better equipped than they had been in Greece. Having fought in 2 major battles, they were now battle-hardened and a well-trained fighting unit. Upon their return from Syria, 25th Battalion was thrust straight into the front line at a key strategic point called WWII Ridge, which was an elevated feature that provided excellent observation for many miles over the desert. The battle had already been raging for 3 weeks by this time. The infantry began their night attack at 4:30 p.m., heading for the Air Mayer Depression. Ian recounted, the arrangement, as we understood it between General Freyberg and the British tank commander, was that armor was to come in to support 25th Battalion and the Maori Battalion as we attempted to break through the Alamein line. It was on this date, July 21, 1942, that Ian had his picture taken while sitting in the desert, enjoying passing the pre-battle time with a pipe and cleaning his rifle. His platoon was spread out around him, waiting for the order to move forward and do his part in the first battle of El Alamein. It was at dusk while they were sitting in the near dark, so the camera had lightened the conditions from what they actually appeared to the human eye. The note on the back reads, taken at 7:30 p.m. on start line of attack by 6th Brigade, not at final battle at El Alamein. Official war photographer A.W. Whitlock came by and happened to snap his photo. Ian didn't pose for the camera, that's just how he looked. 15 minutes later, Ian and his platoon marched off to fight. The next 12 hours would be a wild ride, as presented in the beginning of this video, but this wouldn't be the last terror-raising adventure that Ian would endure. Unknown to the Kiwis, the British tank commander had called off the advance, and the British 2nd and 23rd Armoured Brigades never showed up. They went in alone, without any tank support. Ian described the night. It was a pretty devastating night, with all sorts of stuff flying about. There were tracer bouncing around the desert like cricket balls. When one fellow soldier was hit, Ian was ordered to stay with him and see what he could do for him. I waited with him until he died, while the others went on ahead. He then tried to catch up, but Ian had no compass and didn't know where he was going in the darkness. I just took off on my own. There were shells and stuff dancing around the desert, and I saw a fellow trying to dig a slit trench. I wondered who he was. He was that busy digging, and I got on my hands and knees and looked up at him, and I could see from the shape of his helmet against the starlight that he was German. Ian crept up and shouted, "Who goes there?" The German put his hands in the air. I decided that if he caused any trouble, I would stick him with my bayonet, or shoot him. I told him to put his hands on his head and started marching him along to catch up with the others. Half an hour later, I ran straight into my own fellows and handed the prisoner over. Then I found out that I was that scared that I didn't even have my bayonet fixed. It was in its scabbard on my belt, and my rifle safety catch was on, so I couldn't have shot the German anyway. Later that night, Ian was hit in the upper thigh when he ran into a German patrol. Although the wound was painful, it wasn't life-threatening, so he stayed in the line with his men. As it became dark, 25th Battalion settled down in the desert for the night. When dawn broke, they realized that they had been surrounded by German panzers and infantry who were occupying the high ground around them. Instead of breaking the Alamein line, they had walked into a trap in an area of the desert called the Mirror Depression. And because the British armored brigades had failed to arrive, they were exposed to the 5th and 8th Panzer Regiment's fire. Commander Lieutenant Colonel A.C. George issued a message stating that the situation was hopeless. Ian elected to try his luck to escape the trap. I heard the Daimler engine of one of our scout cars start up and I went over. The two guys in it said that they were going to make a run for it. There was no room for me inside, but I could hang on the outside if I liked. Ian crouched on the outside step of the dingo and held on to the communications mast as the armored scout car took off, followed by a hail of fire when the Germans saw it trying to escape. I suppose we got about 100 to 150 meters before the bullets started hitting the scout car like heavy hail on a tin roof, and then they opened up with the big stuff. An armor-piercing shell hit the ground below my behind and sprayed me with stones, and I could see the shell spinning into the distance. I thought that was getting a bit close to be comfortable, but the next second a high explosive shell hit the scout car between the turret and the car body. I was hanging down as low as I could, and I didn't get hit by the bullets, but the turret was blown 10 yards into the air. We were probably doing about 100 kilometers an hour at that stage, and I hit the deck and was knocked out. I didn't know how long I was there, but when I came round, the Germans were still rounding up prisoners. Ian had lost his steel helmet and weapon in the explosion. Finding both the driver and gunner of the scout car dead, he simply walked away from the wreckage. The Germans were taking no notice of him in the chaos and confusion. A second vehicle, this time an armored Bren carrier, pulled alongside and he climbed aboard, despite it already having 17 men clinging to it. The carrier went over a small hill, hit a minefield at the bottom, and safely negotiated a path through it, before its tracks broke under the weight of the bodies on board. Despite the painful thigh injury he sustained the night before, Ian walked through the stony and hilly desert for 2 days and a night with no food or water before being picked up by a field ambulance and taken to a hospital. He spent 3 weeks there, but hated being cooped up, so he left as soon as he could to rejoin the remnants of 25th Battalion. The Mirror Depression debacle cost the New Zealanders 69 officers and 835 men as casualties, of whom 146 were killed or died of wounds, 335 were wounded, 415 taken prisoner, and 8 missing. The photo ended up being published in the Otago Daily Times, a New Zealand newspaper, a few weeks later as an unnamed New Zealand soldier. Ian's parents, living in Christchurch, recognized him. They hadn't received mail or a telegram from him in a while, so they knew he was still alive from the photo. The caption read, "New Zealanders again in desert battles." This digger of 1942 is typical of the New Zealand soldiers who are again playing an important part in the Middle East campaign, as forward troops in the offensive, which has been launched by the 8th Army in Egypt. What should really grind any Kiwi reviewing this history is the fact that another military disaster had happened a week before and sounds eerily familiar. 2 New Zealand brigades went forward, secured the objectives, but 2 British armored brigades failed to move forward to protect the infantry, and 350 Kiwis were captured. What makes this even worse is that the 2nd Armored Brigade failed to move forward in both operations, and this is over the same area, WWII Ridge. Double Victoria Cross winner Charles Upham was captured and eventually ended up a prisoner in Germany because of this earlier fiasco. This was no fault of the New Zealand brigades, because infantry with few anti-tank guns and no armor in the desert against an armored foe will almost certainly get destroyed. Supposedly, 2nd Armored Brigade belatedly sent forward 2 regiments, but they were halted by mines and anti-tank fire. Later on September 25th, Ian was nominated to join an officer cadet training unit course in recognition of his leadership performance while a sergeant. The next bid to break the Alamein line took place in late October when the 2nd New Zealand Division was better equipped, better led, and allocated the tank and artillery support that they had been denied in July. Ian went into action with his men on October 23rd, following a massive 900-gun artillery barrage just before dusk, which he described as lighting up the sky with tons of high explosive, an amazing sight. Notice in this picture that Ian is eating a can of Swifts, which, if you remember, was the company that he worked for before the war. Ian was there for the decisive breakthrough that won the battle, and with the Germans in full retreat, after a few days, he was pulled out of the front line to begin his officer training course. Upon completing his course, Ian received his officer's commission as a 2nd lieutenant on February 6, 1943, and was transferred from 25th Battalion to 22nd Battalion, where he was given command of Zone Unit, 15th Platoon of 3rd Company. At the time Ian was posted to the 22nd Battalion, it was being converted from a predominantly infantry unit into a motorized battalion designed to be more mobile and bring quick firepower to the enemy. This change meant that 22nd Battalion was given its own dedicated set of vehicles, including armored personnel carriers, armed jeeps, and trucks so that it could provide mobile infantry support to fast-moving armored units. The battalion was trained in the use of these vehicles during the next few months, and Ian must have loved having them at his disposal. By mid-1943, the Allied armies had driven the Germans out of North Africa and the Desert Campaign was over. The focus therefore switched to invading German-held Europe, and the New Zealand Division was selected to participate in the liberation of Italy, arriving in the southern port of Taranto on October 1943, while the invasion of the Italian mainland was already underway. On November 14th, the division moved up the Adriatic coast toward the front line under the command of 8th Army. Italy was a different experience for the New Zealand soldiers. Having spent the better part of the previous 3 years in the barren sands of the North African desert, they thoroughly enjoyed being surrounded by pine forest and a lush green countryside, both of which reminded them somewhat of the farms they left behind in New Zealand. In a similar manner to their earlier experience in Greece, instead of the oppressive desert heat and the ever-present flies, they now woke up to dew-covered grass and birds whistling in the trees. Some of the men stumbled across a bombed-out wine factory near where they were camping. There was a steady stream of jokers, a water tin or hastily rinsed petro jerry can in each hand going to get them filled. Then there were these roaring fires at night and the smell of pine smoke. We sat around these in the evenings and sipped Purple Death and yarned. The 22nd Battalion made its way north through Foggia, San Severo, and Termoli on the eastern side of southern Italy until they arrived at the front which had stabilized in the Sangro Valley. Following the invasion of Italy, the German army had fallen back to a line of mountain ranges which extended across Italy from the Sangro River in the east to Monte Cassino in the west. Named the Gustav Line, this fortified line of defenses took advantage of the naturally steep terrain and deep rivers which crisscrossed Italy from coast to coast. The New Zealand Division was deployed in the Sangro Valley, where the defenders had occupied the northern bank of the Sangro River and the mountain slopes that dominated the valley. The 2nd New Zealand Division's first 2 months of combat in Italy had left some 1,600 men dead or wounded. The morale of the surviving troops was significantly lowered by these losses. The onset of winter, rains, and snow meant that the breaching of the defenses was going to be a slow and attritional process. Ian's 22nd Battalion spent Christmas 1943 in a small town called Salarola, which faced the German lines across the gully. Positioned nearby was the 28th Mallory Battalion, and on Christmas Eve those who were not on guard duty were permitted to visit friends in nearby units. A soldier of 22nd Battalion described how the night lifted their spirits. We had a grand evening, and had been singing our own Christmas carols, all in harmony. During a lull in the singing, we could hear in the distance the voices of Germans singing Silent Night. Then the Maori boys started singing along with them. The next day we were into things again. I have thought more about this incident perhaps than any other, especially at Christmas when I hear the singing of carols. In January 1944, Ian's platoon was tasked with holding an observation post in a ruined farmhouse which faced the nearby German lines. Just after they had dug in, Ian was called back to battalion headquarters to receive further orders, and a heavy snowstorm began. The official history of the 22nd Battalion described the events that followed. At about 5 a.m., we saw staggering towards us a solitary figure through the driving snow. The snow was so thick that he seemed to appear then disappear again. Remembering our instructions not to shoot, we waited while the hair on the back of our necks rose. One of us woke the others, and we all stood too. The figure eventually more or less fell into the room. It was Ian Thomas in a state of almost collapse. He was shaking violently from the cold. We rubbed him hard for a time, and then we persuaded him to lie down and warm up with his greatcoat and practically all the other blankets on him. It was some time before the shivering stopped. We asked him what on earth had brought him out walking on a night like this. He said that he wanted to see how his boys were getting on, and make sure we were all okay. He had started off at about 9 p.m. and had only got a few hundred yards when the blizzard came up. However, the thought of turning back had apparently not occurred to him. In the finish, he was falling face forwards on the snow to make a track for himself through the drifts, which had piled up so high that he was almost out of his depth in it. Within 3 or 4 hours he had recovered his usual vitality and was joking, laughing, and generally enjoying himself thoroughly, in whispers of course, for the blizzard had gone, and all was quiet again and Jerry very close. The Sangro Valley is quite rugged and is similar to a much larger version of the Manawatu Gorge, with steep mountainous sides separated by a river plowing through the valley. Steep country roads now wind up the side of the valley where Ian and 22nd Battalion fought the Germans in the Sangro Valley during the winter of 1943-44, and it isn't difficult to see how a stalemate started. It must have been a tough place to fight and try to stay alive. In mid-January 1944, the New Zealand Division was pulled out of the front line in the Sangro Valley and moved across to the west end of the Gustav Line at Monte Cassino, which was about 80 miles or 130 kilometers from Rome. In February, the division was instructed to relieve the U.S. 34th Infantry Division in the Cassino sector. After several reports from British Indian Army officers suggesting that German forces were occupying the monastery and using it as an observation post, the Allies decided to bomb it on February 15th, killing 230 Italian civilians sheltering there. However, the Germans weren't actually in the monastery, but dug in around it. The Allies were about to learn a hard lesson that the Wehrmacht had already learned at Stalingrad, that ruined buildings make excellent defensive fortresses. Seeing an opportunity, the German 1st Fallschirmjäger, or parachute division, set up a defensive position in the ruins. The Germans were able to see for miles on top of the hill, dominating the coastal plain below with artillery fire and blocking the most direct road going into Rome from the south. The Allied tactical plan was to destroy the fortified heights of Monte Cassino, and then mobile units such as Ian's 22nd Motor Battalion would speed up the road and exploit the breakthrough. As a result, 22nd Battalion was kept in ready reserve to push up the road at a moment's notice, while the other New Zealand infantry battalions were trying to dislodge the German defenders at Monte Cassino. After a couple of months of waiting for the stalemate to be broken, in late March, 22nd Battalion was rotated into the battleground of Cassino Town, which was located at the foot of the imposing hill that they were trying to capture. Ian's men of the 15th Platoon were among those sent into the fight at Cassino, and they occupied ruined buildings in the badly damaged town, and were shelled regularly by the Germans who still clung to the high ground above. After a month of fighting in and around Cassino Town, 22nd Battalion was pulled back and redeployed to guard a river crossing south of the town. While there, the headquarters of 15th Platoon was shelled by the Germans, and 2 of Ian's men died in the explosion. Ian said, "You did what you had to do, and waited for the feed to come on." One can easily appreciate how strategically important Monte Cassino was, and how exposed Ian and his men were to the German artillery fire from the top of the hill when they had attempted to push north along the main road. The Continental Hotel in the Cassino town had been the headquarters of the New Zealand troops while they were fighting there. Shortly afterwards, 22nd Battalion was pulled back from the front line at Cassino to be rested and reorganized after close to 6 months of fighting at Sangro and Cassino. The men were allowed to take short periods of leave in southern Italy to the coastal towns such as Naples and Bari, where they swam in the sea and enjoyed the local food and drink. By late May, the Germans were finally losing their grip on Monte Cassino and the Gustav Line fortifications that had stopped the Allies for 8 months. They withdrew 200 miles north and occupied another defensive line about 11 miles southwest of Florence, which included a little town called La Romola. This wasn't on the future Gothic line, but was south of it. For the next 6 weeks, 22nd Battalion was given leave to visit Rome and the Tuscan countryside. By mid-July 1944, they were back in the line and tasked with knocking out a series of German hilltop strongpoints, which blocked the main route into the city of Florence. La Romola was one of these strongpoints, which would be attacked at night. By this time, Ian was a full lieutenant, and he continued to lead 15th Platoon, which in turn formed a part of 3rd Company. They would spearhead the attack at 1 a.m. on July 31st, but would be surprised at what they came up against. The German defensive fire was very intense in that V-shaped valley. It filled the blasted valley. It was horrible. The noise, dust, and smoke was terrific. The Germans had several well-sited machine gun posts and fortified houses that the Kiwis would have to face. Ian's men in the 15th Platoon broke contact with each other in the noise, smoke, and confusion. However, by running forward in the darkness, they managed to link up again. Their radio operator was killed, so they had no way of knowing how the rest of the attack was proceeding. It was a time of incomprehensibility to most of us. Attacking in uncoordinated, isolated groups, the Kiwis were determined to win the fight. Visibility was only a few feet, with a fog of sour-smelling dust and smoke thrown up by shells. Getting off the start line was the worst part, Bill Windsor stated. We met shelling and counter-shelling in the creek. Keeping touch in the platoon was tough, but we got 'em up there. But the enemy was misled too. Several parties of Germans, absolutely convinced that the attack had failed, walked innocently into captivity or death. Lieutenant Ian Thomas and his platoon of 24 men were pinned down under heavy fire. With a total disregard for his own safety, Ian and his Tommy gun charged 2 machine gun posts, one after another, all by himself, and killed or wounded all of the defenders. Ian's heroic actions not only continued the advance, but also inspired the men by Ian's cheerfulness and courage. He would later be awarded the Military Cross for these brave actions. On June 1, 1945, General Freyberg issued this citation to Ian Thomas. It was with great pleasure that I read in Army orders that you had been awarded the MC for gallant and distinguished service in the field, and I wish to send you my personal congratulations. I will now read the Military Cross citation verbatim. On the night of 31st July, 1944, in the attack upon La Romola, Lieutenant Thomas's platoon became separated from the remainder of the unit soon after the crossing of the start line. About the same time, and for a period of at least 2 hours thereafter, radio communications failed, and the platoon became isolated. Its task was to advance up the leading ridge into the village. To oppose the attack, the enemy had well-sighted machine gun posts and fortified houses, from which positions heavy fire was brought to bear on the advancing troops. In spite of these discouraging circumstances, Lieutenant Thomas demonstrated such qualities of courage and organization that before first light he had entered the village with 24 men, and at dawn carried on to his final objective, the village Cecchenerini. His courage, his cheerfulness, and his complete disregard for his own safety were factors of great inspiration to his men. On 2 occasions, when the platoon was pinned down by heavy fire from machine gun posts, Lieutenant Thomas himself charged the post and with his Tommy gun killed or wounded the defenders, allowing the advance to be continued. He displayed consistent gallantry under the heaviest fire, and by his example inspired his men to maintain the advance with the greatest possible momentum. The 15th Platoon pushed up the hill and reached the first house halfway up, were shelled and fired on by a machine gun near the house, which was cleaned up. The second nest was cleaned out, and right next to the village, 15th Platoon was held up for at least 2 hours in an unoccupied 2-story second house on the fringe of La Romola, trying to make contact with the other platoons. 13th Platoon emerged from the gloom and fired a Bren above the house until Ian's men yelled at them to stop. As time went on, the shelling seemed to subside, with only the occasional Spandau fire. Once in a while, a German would suddenly throw a grenade and then disappear just as quickly. A small group from 14th Platoon appeared and guarded Ian's prisoners, and then Ian and his men set out again with no tank support. The first streaks of dawn were beginning to show, and they were surprised as they looked around. In this fashion we arrived at the village of La Romola, just as daylight came up and brought us back to the world of comparative reality. 21 prisoners were taken, and probably 50 to 60 of the enemy had been killed. The battalion had lost 1 officer and 7 men killed, and 1 officer and 21 others wounded. La Romola, undefended in the daylight, turned out to have been just one fairly long, winding main street and plenty of short streets. It had a church tower at the left end, and many gullies leading off the main ridge. The village of La Romola still stands on a hilltop in Tuscany. The hill is deceptively steep, and it's easy to see how the German defenders had the terrain overwhelmingly in their favor. One can also imagine how confusing and chaotic it must have been to charge up the hill while under enemy fire, running into unseen olive trees in the darkness and losing contact with the men on either side of you. 2 nights later, on August 1st, 1944, 3rd Company of 22nd Battalion was again called upon to take La Poggiorna, the next ridge between La Romola and Florence, which was still occupied by the Germans. A summary of what the official war history of the ensuing battle and Ian's part in it follows. 3rd Company, lining up to take La Poggiorna Ridge, had been depleted by the earlier attack to 3 platoons, 13th, 15th, and 16th platoons. At 11 p.m., Ian and his men waited 100 yards away for the creeping barrage to begin, which would move 100 yards every 5 minutes. They advanced along a road to a group of buildings in a square courtyard. Beyond this, there was 400 yards of open, flat, scrubby ground leading to La Poggiorna Ridge, which 3rd Company had to take before daylight. As Ian's platoon advanced, most of the trouble came from houses bordering the road, which gradually curved and rose. After about 800 yards, Ian's men were on a small ridge with trees. They noticed that their own shells seemed to be hitting the tops of the trees and bursting, so that there were constant tinkle-tinkle, spatter-spatter of shrapnel. Around this time, 15th Platoon was sent to do a do-over on a house on one side of the road. As Ian's truck was going under a brick gate, a mortar round hit above them, showering 8 men with shrapnel, including Corporal Dick Shepard and Private Ridding, who mentioned the inspiration and confidence that radiated from Lieutenant Thomas, both then and during all previous events, even though Ian and many of the others were seriously wounded. They were taken to a military field hospital for treatment on August 2nd, before being sent on to an army hospital in Cairo. In addition to the shrapnel wounds to his leg and hip area, Ian was also badly concussed, and he remembered little of the weeks he spent recuperating before being discharged from the hospital on September 24, 1944. By October 1944, the war in Europe was entering its final months, and the Germans were retreating on all fronts. So it was decided that Ian and a number of other recuperating Kiwi soldiers would return to New Zealand, rather than being pressed back into action. After a final period of leave, he embarked on a ship for home shores, arriving in Wellington on January 3, 1945. Ian said that World War II was tough, but it brought out the best in men. By the end of the war, Ian had been wounded 5 times in 4 years. It is surprising that despite having been a tough, proficient, and very successful fighting force, only 19 officers and 40 other soldiers from 25th Battalion have been decorated. The battalion's total list of killed, wounded, and prisoners of war numbered more than 2,300, a 52% attrition rate. For a few minutes, let's diverge from the main story some. This backstory of a New Zealand airman will make sense in a little bit. Alan Armistice Fraser was born on November 11, 1918, which is Armistice Day for World War I, which must be why his middle name was Armistice. Alan met and married Elizabeth Joan Buchanan. After only 10 days, Alan left for Great Britain to be the pilot of a Vickers Wellington Mark III twin-engine, long-range medium bomber as part of the Royal New Zealand Air Force. Attached to 75th Squadron, Allen and his crew of 4 flew in a night raid over Emden, Germany on June 20, 1942. There were few searchlights, but the flak was intense in the cloudy, low-visibility sky. They dropped their bombs but couldn't see the results, so they headed back home while hugging the Dutch coast. A German Junkers 88 attacked one of the other bombers in Allen's formation, but there were no casualties. As they passed over the western portion of Ameland, it is believed that a German night fighter attacked Allen's bomber and they crashed into the sea. All 5 men were casualties. 4 of the 5 crewmen washed ashore the eastern sister island of Schiermonnikoog, off the Dutch coast, where they are buried to this day. Allen was only 23 years old. As a side note, I have personally stayed 3 days on Ameland, and I can tell you that it is one of the most beautiful and windy places on Earth, although the water is very cold. The point of this divergent story is that, back in New Zealand, Elizabeth was a war bride who was suddenly a widow, and very eligible for a decorated war hero returning home. Once back in New Zealand, Ian resumed his pre-war occupation as a fat stock buyer in Ruatoria. While continuing as an officer in the Army Reserve, he was finally demobilized on April 11, 1945. He also met and married the earlier mentioned widow Elizabeth Fraser in 1945. A month later, on May 10, 1945, it was announced in the London Gazette that he had been awarded the Military Cross for his actions at La Romola. Ian went on to become a sheep farmer and in 1953 settled on a returning serviceman's farm. He gave up pipe smoking not too long after the war. He and Elizabeth had 5 children, Stephen, Chris, Jane, Jenny, and Vicky, and 10 grandchildren and many great-grandchildren, all of whom loved him dearly. Here is a photo of Ian, Elizabeth, and their 5 kids in 1961. His grandchildren knew him only as Papa. Ian would meet with fellow Kiwi war veterans every year on Anzac Day, the 25th of April, which was Remembrance Day for New Zealand and Australia, to remember their mates who never returned home. Ian never considered himself a hero, just a bloke serving his country. He probably thought about the loss of friends in past battles. The severe hip wound that he sustained in 1944 at La Pajorna from mortar shrapnel continued to cause him discomfort for the rest of his life. Over the years, he had 4 hip replacement operations, but never let it stop him living an active life, riding horses, fishing, motorbikes, and shepherding stock on his rugged hill country farm. Ian spent many successful years as a farmer and retired with Elizabeth in Greytown. Ian knew about the famous photo and remembered the photographer taking it. He had a framed copy of the photo in his house and was proud of it. Years later, Ian was honored to have his iconic photo appear in the center of a memorial stained glass window that commemorates 25th Battalion at the New Zealand Army War Museum. Ian believed that the fact that he was able to snatch a few winks of sleep just before a battle, unlike many other soldiers, may have explained his ability to react at the right moment. Most soldiers found the few moments before a battle the worst. It was the uncertainty, the feeling of the unknown while you waited, that was hard to take. I was lucky because I could lie down and take a short nap, but not everyone could do that. One of the outstanding traits of the New Zealand soldier was their ability to overcome poor training and leadership and inferior weaponry against a highly trained and much better armed enemy already blooded in modern battle tactics. Ian reflected on this later. Often it was a case of luck. You wait for the right time and just hope luck's with you. It was a matter of getting up out of the trenches and besting the enemy however you could. Ian detested a 1986 book called Myth and Reality that had his picture on the cover and at the beginning of every chapter. It depicted Kiwis as drunks led by incompetent leadership. Ian gave news interviews speaking against the conclusions of the book. While acknowledging that there was a little of that in every army, the Kiwis in World War II were fighting bad equipment, poor training, a veteran German army, and officers with a World War I mentality. New Zealand soldiers overcame these disadvantages and did pretty well considering their situation. Years later, his famous photo as the typical Kiwi soldier was also used on the front cover of New Zealanders at War, a comprehensive history of all New Zealand military campaigns fought since the country was founded. Ian's grandson Ben, grew up knowing that his papa had served with distinction during the war, including reading Papa's Military Cross citation, one of only about 250 awarded during World War II. It sparked a lifelong interest in history. Ben wanted to know more and interviewed Ian on 2 separate occasions to record his recollections of his war experiences. Ian wanted him to write everything down so he wouldn't have to repeat them. Ben traveled a lot around Europe and visited most of his papa's battlefields in Greece, Crete, where Ian passed through, El Alamein, and throughout Italy. Ben also visited the Commonwealth War Cemetery, where hundreds of New Zealand soldiers are buried under the imposing hill of Monte Cassino to pay his respects. He also felt proud to visit La Romola, that special place where his papa and his mates fought and some died. One has to wonder how much present-day Italians know about the sacrifices made to free them from fascism and Nazism. General Freiberg called the 25th Battalion resolute, determined, and courageous soldiers. He later acknowledged that of all the actions the division undertook, none was more important than the advance towards Tobruk on November 23rd in the early stages of Operation Crusader. If we had not done so, the Battle of Alamein would have been fought a year earlier and without the Sherman tank. Ian recalled, "It was an honor to fight alongside those men, and an honor to be singled out for bravery when there was courage displayed to a man. And that's why those who never made it home must be remembered." Unfortunately, Ian's wife, Elizabeth, predeceased him in the year 2000. On September 8, 2007, Ian passed away peacefully at age 90 in Masterton, New Zealand. I want to personally thank Ben Fitchett, his mother Jane Fitchett, and Ben's aunt Vicki Connolly for the invaluable background information and photos. A good portion of the transcript for this video was written by Ben Fitchett, so he shares a writing credit. Without their help, this video wouldn't have been possible.